Okay, so welcome. Anastasios Gaetanidis is going to be speaking to us and is going to be talking about is going to be talking about uh, aspects of the conference-related hope and despair, but especially in regards to the life. Is it the life that does not live? So go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I was fundamentally, I'm planning to address this topic by first examining Kierkegaard's idea of despair in his book *The Sickness Unto Death*, where he examines different types of despair and gives us a different account of different despairing ontological positions. He's very good in describing different types of despair based on the different distinctions he made between the infinite and definite, the necessity and possibility, and also how much the despair. Oh, sorry, I think I've just lost you. Okay. Between the finite and infinite, between necessity and possibility, between being conscious of one's despair or experiencing some unconscious despair or non-conscious at least, because he doesn't have a kind of concept of the unconscious as such. So he has these different sort of polarities that in his mind there is despair which you can find in every one of them if you emphasize one part of the polarity more than the other, if there is a kind of dialectical engagement which transcends and moves you into a different plane. So if you emphasize the infinite over the finite existence, so if you emphasize the part of imagination and thinking that there is a kind of a sense of grandiosity in a way in the way you think about yourself and the world, and you don't recognize your limitations, for example, of your finite limitations, there is a problem in terms of living a very unrealistic and surreal life. If you limit yourself too much on what is available, and you don't have the power of imagination to think something that extends and moves beyond what is, then again you despair because you are not able to think beyond what is given, beyond the facticity of life. Then he moves to the sense of, again, the possibility and necessity. There is a certain out of our mortality, the way of our bodies and the way of being in the world. We have a sense of limitation in terms of what is necessary and causal. But then there is also a sense of that something that moves beyond that, the present and what is to the future. So it's not simply how we are in the present moment, but also we project ourselves in the future, and there is a possibility of becoming, of changing. So there's always these two polarities of necessity. If you fix too much on what is necessary and deterministic, you cannot escape from the power of the present and the past. And if you focus too much on becoming, then you lose the power of being and, what is realistic and what can be materialized in a way and realized in the present. So there is always a sense of this dialectical intertwining that takes place in Kierkegaard. And it's a wonderful thing for psychotherapists also to explore in terms of, what are these different types of despair that we can observe in our clients in terms of whether they focus on one part of the polarity or the other. Now, there is something, fundamentally despair arises for Kierkegaard as a way of a kind of misrelation or a kind of misrecognition of one's self in the relation that oneself has with oneself and with another. So there is a kind of misrelation, a kind of misstep, and a sense of missing something always, that it doesn't quite, fall. In order to find oneself, you need to be able to be in relation, a self-reflexive relation with oneself and with another. And, throughout the steps that he provides in the sickness unto death, there is something quite productive about despair. the sense of it moves us. If we are not in despair, then we don't realize that something is missing. There is something in that relation with oneself that is missing, and the relation with another. So it becomes a productive sort of feeling, as long as it makes you push yourself out of the kind of the things that are the way you function usually, and makes you question. There is something about the despair and the anxiety that produces that makes you question, though there is something is not right. There is something about the relationship of oneself to the self and to another that is quite incongruent. And there is a sense of how you become more honest and more congruent with oneself, and more transparent to oneself and the other, in order to make this progression in terms of finding oneself. A lot of people, he says, there is always always trying to find oneself, but in the process they manage to lose it, either because they fix on one term of the polarity or another, or because also the world doesn't care about people finding themselves, because the world, he says, for itself is the last thing the world cares about, and the most dangerous thing of all for a person to show signs of having it. So there is something about the world also that provides obstacles to finding oneself, because finding oneself truly and honestly without other resorts to fantastic or infinite or abstract sort of concepts, and or limiting concreteness, having this sort of dialectic in place and in motion provides, can unsettle people, that someone can feel secure in that sort of selfhood enough to be able to challenge the world and how it is. In many ways, there is a emphasis on interiority and reflexivity, and a sense of being able to find this sort of interiority and inwardness and to reflect on the despair that you feel, in order to move to the things that you're missing and repair the misrelation that is happening. Of course, this implies that you have a very active relationship with yourself. You have a relationship with yourself that is constantly in conflict. Is a sense of that you are unsettled. You don't just settle into something. You're constantly unsettled, and you want to find something that makes you want to address that despair and repair whatever misrecognition or misrelationship there is between oneself and this image that we have of yourself, as well as the relation between oneself and the other. Well, the ability to have that sense of selfhood constantly challenged by one's self-reflexivity, as well as by the relation with another, is very important. Nowhere more so than in his. So you can imagine that Kierkegaard, of course, is a religious thinker, and for him, the importance of all of this is there is only so far we can go trying to find oneself in these attempts to address the different polarities between infinity and finiteness, abstractness and concreteness, possibility and necessity, being and becoming. All of these are earthly categories. He says there is almost at some point that we have to make the leap to be able, in order to find ourselves, we need to lose them first. To find the self, we need to lose the self. And how we lose it? We lose it in the faith we have towards God, the big other, someone that we trust, and before God, we lose ourselves, and we trust that God will replenish and give us back. There is an action of surrender, a leap of faith, an action of surrender to the other, who we know, however much we try in a way to create oneself, we need actually to surrender ourselves to the idea that we cannot create ourselves. There is something bigger, more powerful, that created us. And once we come, we feel our creatureliness, in the sense that we are creatures of something that we have been created. And we are not self-created. We can live ourselves the fantasies and the expectations that we are the masters of the universe. And there is a kind of humbleness and humility in that for him. Now, we don't need to go as far as Kierkegaard and think about that we are, to think of God as what created us. But there is something about really important in this aspect of recognizing one's sort of attempts to always, to be masterfully creating our own image of our own selves through these notions that he provides at the beginning, which are important and therapeutic in many ways. And in my work as a therapist, I have managed to use Kierkegaard effectively to explore these conflicts between, what a person might think there is in terms of fantasy and the reality of this, and trying to find ways to negotiate it. All right. So, it's therapeutically useful. However, there is something quite extraordinary about that concept if we remove God as the ultimate arbiter of meaning. And, what we are left with. If he's not the one who actually, gives us ourselves back, how do we actually use each other in a kind of a sense that we move beyond our own self-sufficiency and the idea that we are enough to make ourselves happy, to understand our need for others, and the sense that the other, whether that is, God for Kierkegaard, or for us, the other, any other, concrete other, and even the other in a more abstract sense, humanity or nature or any other that is not sort of determined by us, we cannot exist without being in relation to it. So there is a fundamental relationality. And this is because I'm also a relational psychotherapist, and that's what I want to emphasize. Fundamental relationality of the self to the other that cannot be abstracted, cannot be sort of taken away out of the equation, that we cannot create ourselves in ex nihilo, or we cannot make ourselves sort of important without, fundamentally being constituted by this relationship with another, but also being undone by this relationship with another, because what constitutes us, what makes us up, also can tear us down, right? The relationship with another is what makes us, constitutes us, but also is what can possibly, and that, for example, because I work with bereavement and grief, it's very important to realize how the people who love and actually they become part of who we are, they also, when we lose them, there is a fundamental crisis in one's identity, one's self. So the people who we use in order to build us up, they also fundamentally can tear us down. So there is this sense of the impossibility of having a self without being in relation to another. That is most accentuated by loss, but also by love. That love is also the sense that, how we feel about ourselves when we are in love. Now, I want to say that, in this respect, despair for Kierkegaard had this positive sort of meaning of moving us out of this sort of obsession with creating oneself and realizing that we are not enough. We want more. There is more. Whether that is God or nature or others, or, we're dependent on others. We need others. We have this sort of, whether that is something more than us that we need in order to constitute ourselves. And despair is a positive sort of thing that makes us uneasy about our sort of complicit and compliant relationship we have with ourselves, in order to move and to open up and to have this leap of faith in the other. Whether that is God, for Kierkegaard, for us, can be the other with a smaller. So for me, this is absolutely crucial. Now, however, there are, as he recognized himself, I also see that there is something about the sickness of our times that stops us from actually connecting with the other, and of course not enabling ourselves to develop fully as selves, right? Because we cannot be selves without the other. There is always a relation with the other. So in that sense, by we live in the world that there is a fundamental sort of denial of the suffering of others, either through sort of the development of media that, constantly accentuates the suffering that is always temporary. It lasts, a day or two, and then we move to the next news. So there's a kind of bombardment, of constant sort of bombardment of suffering that doesn't register as real anymore. It becomes abstract and infinite, and it doesn't have a concreteness into one's life. So the suffering but also our own emotionality that dominates our everyday encounters with ourselves, that becomes also quite problematic. So, and I think because there is so much suffering, because there is so much lack of connectivity and sensitivity to other people's suffering, real sensitivity, we find ourselves more and more becoming numb to the pain and the possible despair we might feel, which can activate us to seek that connection and make that sort of leap onto the other, open ourselves out. We start to turn ourselves to know nothing so as to avoid feeling anything, because there is perhaps also too much to feel, and then we feel overwhelmed, so we try to deny it, or become, because we are told that not to come to terms and connect with our vulnerabilities, because being vulnerable implies a certain sense of weakness. And we see that in therapy, in therapeutic situations again and again, how people see vulnerability as weakness, as not as a source of pain that can connect and suffering that can connect with suffering of others, so as to maintain strong connections. So I think, however, there is a problem with that, because if we turn ourselves to nothing, if we turn ourselves to something that doesn't feel anymore, and it's anti-emotional, doesn't register, and either despair or the emotions of others, how can we actually, how can we actually feel alive to this connection that we need to our own and other bodies and other sort of selves? How can we actually register? Because the only time that we don't register suffering is when we numb ourselves to that. And of course, the numbness is aching to death, the kind of death while you're alive. So if you don't feel that despair in terms of what is happening in the world, if you don't feel the despair in terms of your own self that it loses this connectivity, if you don't feel that despair in terms of what is happening in today's market ideology, that people, where the health of the markets is prioritized and the economy is prioritized over the health of people, if you don't feel the despair and the suffering of yourself and others, how you are able to move beyond this and create something new and something better, how you can extend beyond oneself and see the other. And this is where I feel that we become, by cultivating sensitivity, by cultivating lack of awareness of one's vulnerability, by cultivating a sense that everything is temporary, and we cannot form committed relationships with others, by making ourselves and our bodies as irrelevant in the face of social and economic realities. It means, like, on some level, it's very easy to move to this sort of lack of sensitivity, lack of aliveness, and turn it into a kind of insensitivity to what happens to anyone. So whether someone dies or lives, it doesn't matter. We become insensitive to the pain of others, insensitive to our own pain and despair, and that can lead to a life that does not live. And of course, a life that does not live cannot register the importance of the loss of the other. And if you don't register the importance of the loss of the other, then the other becomes irrelevant, and whether he lives or dies or she lives or dies doesn't matter anymore. So for me, that's why I used in my abstract also the work of Adorno, who says what is decisive here is the absorption of biological destruction by collective will. For only humanity, Adorno suggests in Minima Moralia, to whom death has become as indifferent as its members, that has itself died, can inflict it administratively on innumerable people. So if you don't feel, become indifferent to death, you become indifferent to suffering, you become indifferent to despair. It doesn't matter who experiences anymore and whether it happens to others. You are not registering it. And if there is to be hope, the despair of a life that does not live, the life that we experience at the moment, that turns ourselves and others into a kind of negligible quantity, which is entirely assimilated by the market system, needs to be acknowledged so as to lead to the symbolic death of our disconnected self and the rebirth of a self that is constituted by a connection to others. So Kierkegaard nowadays becomes even more relevant, and his notion of despair becomes a kind of feeling that we can, prioritize and emphasize as a way of connecting back to something, to a living collective, to a living collective which can actually create the conditions for something new. So I will stop here. These were my reflections on the topic, and I hope I've given you some sort of indications of what I tried to summarize it as much as I could, because I've written quite a lot. But these are the my reflections at the moment. So in many ways we are living in a time that is both dangerous and despairing. But if we own that despair, we can actually fully own that despair and explore that disconnection and the suffering that produces. We can find the missing link, and the missing link with a living collectivity that can change things.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I have a question, and then we can see what others' questions and comments are. One of my questions is, it's very interesting the way you say that Kierkegaard's experience can be relevant for us, even for people who don't have faith, even for people who don't have faith, it can have relevance because it encourages pushing on, using despair as a kick to move on to relation with others. Now, you talked about more than one kind of despair. What do you do if you have a client who experiences lots of despair, but the despair is not over the pain of others, it's over the pain of self? Does that still push them onto relation with others, or what do you say to a person like that?
I think there is something, often if you dig under the despair of that, there is something despair of disconnectedness, isolation, a sense of not being understood, not being seen, and actually it's not simply that, it's also the inability to contribute, to be recognized, one's contribution to be recognized by the other. To be seen as someone contributing. So I think there is something fundamentally, the sickness of our times, the sickness unto death, it's the real despair, it's this lack of connection, this lack of sense, which leads to fundamental forms of alienation and social isolation, and disconnection and dislocation, that makes people feel, despairing within oneself. And I think that despair can, if it registers, and you can use it therapeutically, you can push people to think, well, how can I connect? What are the ways I can find to instead of feeling isolated and alienated, what are the ways that I can find to connect with others and to be seen? And of course, the first person that can do that is the therapist himself. How it can be seen by the therapist and how it can be worked in the therapy itself. But I think sometimes the dyadic form of therapy is not enough. You need a community. I mean, that's why group therapies and communities are important, to have that sort of collectivity where people feel that, their despair is not simply their own, but can be served and work collectively,
So if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that what you can do is people can be despairing within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that pushes them into a relationship to get recognition, to get all these benefits. But then as they do that, they will start to feel, they'll gain sensitivity to the pain of others. That just sort of naturally happens.
Yes, I think there is something about this sort of form of despair that makes you think that you are the only one who suffers. Right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And of course, your suffering is important. It needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be recognized. But sometimes, what we do in therapy is to address, to contain the suffering and listen to it and provide the listening ear, the other who is able there to connect and create the sense that we can be trusted to be dependable for others in order to give that listening ear and that sort of empathic understanding. So as for people to be able to contain the suffering, recognize, okay, there is suffering, but it's not just me.
Right.
There is, more suffering out there, and actually, my own stuff is important, but it's not the most relevant.
Right. Thank you. And other Anthony and Kaveri, you could comment or ask questions if you have something to say. You don't have to.
So I don't have a question per se, but I just wanted to, reflect upon Sir's talk because it has given me a perspective of, I would say, despair or the importance of despair in this time. Because I hadn't looked at both the terms hope and despair. Of course, I can look at hope and, the importance of hope just comes with the word. But, the importance of despair in this time, I think that is something that I, really it was very interesting for me to see, and to just reflect that yes, despair and, looking at your own despair and then someone else's despair and comparing that was, it gave me a perspective. So just wanted to thank Sir for such
Thank
an
you.
insightful talk.
Thank you, Kaveri. I just think that, Kierkegaard becomes interesting simply because he doesn't see despair as something negative, right? As something that is, as he doesn't see anxiety, for example. That's part of existentialism and such. Anxiety it can be, it's not simply a pathology, and despair is not simply pathological. There are signs that, of a kind of misrelation with oneself and with another, and signs that say something needs to change, something needs to be walked through, and and if you remove it too quickly and you try to provide antidotes with social media, with entertainment, with distracting oneself, which we do all with addictions, right? Which of course I think this is the other thing, and we are not allowing to pay attention to the real sort of the real issues underneath our despair, then and the conflicts that, between the different polarities that Kierkegaard describes that are very significant, then we get stuck and we don't address anything and we just perpetuate the same. And I think that in itself becomes a very interesting idea for me, that, you don't try to just remove despair very quickly. You just stay with it and actually examine. Well, let's be curious. What is happening? What is going on? What makes you feel despairing? And and work with it instead against it. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
So, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
I mean, I suppose my question is, what is despair? I keep coming back to what is despair. It's a bit like it's a catch-all term for a multi-complex thing. It reminds me of cancer. Cancer is multi. There is no one cancer.
Yes.
And in biology, we almost have come to the terms with personalized disease, that everybody's disease is different, and the same with despair, that it's a very interesting question what it is. In the previous session I was in, it was really, despair was vocalized as almost a photograph of somebody collapsed in a corner, hiding their face. And I suppose my question to everyone here is, what is despair, and is it that? Is it that? Because that's very different than a person who's lying face down on the floor. It's a different embodiment of what despair is, and I think we have to almost look at an embodiment to get what we're talking about.
I think you're right, but that's why I think Kierkegaard for me becomes quite significant, because there isn't a kind of catch-all despair. He develops different categories of despair depending on the conflicts and the kind of which polarities of the despair you accentuate, and all of these become different ways of being in the world and of becoming as well. Which there is despair about not want to be oneself, and the despair about being oneself. There is different types of despair for him. There is a despair of wanting to stay in the abstract and not feeling the limits of one's own facticity. And there is despair of staying within the limits of one's facticity and not want to use one's imagination. So there are different types of despair, and that's why Kierkegaard, if you read him carefully, provides a variety of despair. And I think it's very easy, because when a client comes to I'm despairing, I mean, it's almost like giving a label to something that can be very complex. So we need to actually unpick it and unpick it and take away the mystification of it, and actually go into the concreteness of what is this despair for them. Okay, so I think I'll have to finish here, because Roger, it's time for me, isn't it?
That's right. That is correct.
Thank you, Andy, for the question.
Thank you very much.